Life is Feudal MMO set itself out to be a hardcore survival MMO inspired by northern medieval Europe. This sounds like the medieval open world masterpiece we'd all been waiting for, right? Yet almost half a decade ago, peaking with thousands of players coming to experience something that they hoped would be pretty special, now the game is a barren wasteland. This is how realism destroyed Life is Feudal MMO.
Intro cinematic plays, decent voiceover actually. Actually very decent voiceover, hang on. Is that? It is. Sean Bean narrated this intro movie. Every character Sean Bean has ever played starts full of promise and then dies, which is fitting as this game did the same.
Coming off the back of an incredible successful Life is Feudal Your Own launch with a budget reportedly of $500,000 and earning around 10 million, Bitbox Limited wanted to take their open world medieval survival with multiple servers and player-friendly mechanics and turn it into its own fully fledged MMO. They wanted it to have one server, up to 10,000 players, a world that dwarfed what had come before and became the pinnacle of the historical MMO genre. A genre that has been crying out for something new. It has always been played with scams and failed titles, people promising too much, going too big and never quite delivering on what the players actually require to stick around. And this story goes along some very familiar lines. Developers promising something massive but never quite delivering. Yet I could talk about the horrible optimization of Life is Feudal MMO, things like the floating logs or constant glitches within the game. I could mention the toxic fanbase or the sheer lack of a fanbase by the end of its life, but none of that is what really killed it. People can forgive issues, bugs and server instability to some extent, but the nature of what killed it is far more subtle, something that players actually normally ask for. But what they didn't realize is it's not actually what they wanted. Let's start with the inventory system. This is the first sign of the developers wanting to put realism over actual use and gameplay. Inventory systems are such a core base for most games, and specifically MMOs, games that you have to survive in an open world, gathering resources, building, interacting with other players. Having a good UI where you're able to move things around and make sure that you actually know what you're doing at a quick glance is paramount to making an easy to use experience. Most inventory systems in games work with grids. They allows easy to move things, so you don't have to click exactly on each item. Hitboxes can be kind of vague. You're able to click and move items very, very fast. Also, the ability to quick move stuff. Minecraft does this with a control left click, able to instant move stuff from one inventory to another. This is how inventories have worked for so long, and there's a reason for this, because it works fantastically. Despite its many issues, I actually really like something like the DayZ standalone inventory system. Having the grids that are split up with certain different items that have certain different capacities. For example, a torch might take up 3 blocks, or a can of beans might take up 1. This means that you have a limited space in your backpacks or whatever inventory space you're carrying, yet you have some customization to be able to sort things in a different way, almost a little bit like playing Tetris to make stuff squeeze in your bag a bit better, almost like real life, where putting certain items in certain places, rolling them up in certain ways or putting them in certain orders will actually help you fit more in your inventory. But Life is Feudal saw this. It saw the standard and it said no. It said, look, this is cool and all, but what about realism? They went with a completely free-flowing inventory system. Sounds cool on the surface, right? Everything just goes anywhere. Well, if anyone has ever moved from Windows to a Mac, you will know what I'm talking about here. Windows, everything is sorted perfectly. Dragging a file into a folder will put it in a grid, and it can be sorted by dates, times, modified dates, so on and so forth. Yet Macs work a bit differently. Dragging things into a folder will just put it in a scattered spree of everything layered on top of each other, trying to drag things apart, so making sure you can actually find them. And yes, you can sort them eventually, but it is baffling why that is not the default. And Life is Feudal went for the same system. Dragging something into an inventory space, well, it is just that. It is just space. Things will get layered on top of each other. The hitboxes are so small on items that you'll often misclick and move something from behind the item because items will get stuck behind each other. You'll either lose them completely or really struggle to interact with them, at least in fast-paced action.
Like, what is this? Like, I'm trying to...
Why are you peeing back? What the hell? Half this stuff. I didn't even realise I had in my inventory. Why the hell would anyone think a free-flowing space without any snapping or grid is a good idea? It looks and it feels horrible. If the UI is stressing me out right at the start, there's not actually that much hope for the actual game-changing mechanics later on. The adage that I can't get out of my head with Life is Feudal MMO is wide as an ocean, deep as a puddle. And this is no more apparent in the map itself, the perfect metaphor for this game. The map in Life is Feudal Your Own, its predecessor, was 9 square kilometers. And because of the nature of that game, it took a decent amount of time to explore. Because, I mean, it's medieval. Running around or having a horse is your only choice, but horses come way, way later down the line. So, okay, we're running around. It's pretty decently sized. You're going to be running for a long, long time, yet it seemed to work for most people. And this is the map for the MMO. 21 kilometers squared. It was huge. Forests, open landscapes, mountains, oceans. And don't get me wrong, when I saw this, when it was announced, I was blown away and incredibly excited because everybody in their head thinks bigger is better until they actually have to move from one side of the map to the other. I remember back in the day when the developers were teasing this map, they mentioned how such a large scale up was to compensate for the plans of now going up to 10,000 players on one server. Yet on release, the MMO capped out about 5,300 concurrent players, not even close to 10,000. I mean, Life is Feudal Your Own, for comparison, had 8,000 concurrent players at its peak, so the MMO had 3 times the map size with just 2/3 of the player count. Yeah, that map's gonna be pretty empty. And it was. Over and over again, I'd jump in with my clan. New players would want to join and we'd say, go on, hop in. They'd then spawn in, run around for multiple hours, either to eventually find us or just give up. On the way, they'd see no one. They'd see nothing because people didn't just settle out in the middle of nowhere. It was a barren wasteland. When people did settle, they were miles away from any other players, so forming real economies and relationships like allies and enemies was not all that doable, which a game like this that relied on players interacting made it impossible. The map took 4 hours to run from one side to another. That is mental, especially if there's nothing in between those 2 points. The developers just fell into this pitfall that so many other MMOs and games fall into. Bigger is better, but never has this been proven more wrong than with Life is Feudal MMO. Map size is so important for an open world game. It can breathe life into it, like a GTA 5, or it can kill the game entirely. Rust has done this pretty well. Along with the generous but controlled map sizes of around 8 kilometers squared, they also have it configurable to whoever runs the server. Less people make the map smaller. And even despite me praising Life is Feudal Your Own, the same developers that went on to go overboard with the MMO even got it wrong somewhat in Your Own. It was 9 kilometers squared, way, way smaller than 21 kilometers squared. But the server sizes were 64 players. So even then, it was ridiculously too big for the amount of players you're actually letting into this world. Granted, the MMO didn't have the choice. They had the ability for 10,000 people to play on such a big map, and that might have helped build it up more. It's just no one really wanted to play the game. Yet with Life is Feudal Your Own, they managed to get away with it because, I mean, the game was smaller in general. Yet if you take those issues that Your Own had and you scale them up to the MMO, that is just blowing up issues to epic proportions. So, we have an open world MMO set in medieval times. So there has to be combat, right? That's kind of the end game of this, having warring nations that create their towns and settlements that then make relationships, allies and enemies with each other, go to war and fight. Well, that was kind of supposed to be the selling point. The battles were an awesome thing, kind of based off the persistent world mod for Mount & Blade. And that's what gets everybody hyped. When players come together to form clans, all having their own roles, from king all the way down to blacksmith and serf. But when it actually comes to reality, it tells a different story. You see, for this to work, you have to have players that reach every single part of a game. When a player-driven economy comes about, you have to have people that will happily spend hours and hours planting and chopping trees to help the people that spend hours and hours making weapons, that will then help the people that spend hours and hours training to be a knight. Yet the reality of it, everybody wants to be that knight. Nobody wants to be farming for 30 hours just to feed people and then do it all over again. Because at that point, you've just got a second job. Everybody wants to be the knight that goes to battle with their clan, but it is not possible in a game that relies on a completely player-driven economy, because there's no players that want to do the economy bit. They just want to do the fighting bit. As mentioned, Life is Feudal MMO completely relies on a player-driven economy, meaning that the players decide how much items are worth by how much resources are produced. They will trade with each other, and of course, they will generate these resources themselves. Yet, having a game that's solely focused on this, that the entire mechanics are based around, then not making it player-friendly, is the recipe for a disaster. There were no small clans within Life is Feudal MMO. There was pretty much no solo survivors, no quaint little villages that would make up the backbone of any real economy, no people that just wanted to be farmers or blacksmiths, that wanted to live their life as medieval peasants. It was always big castles and massive clans, or nothing. So everything just starts to fall apart. It works for some time, it works for short periods, yet when people start to realize that in order to go to battle and have 30 minutes of fun, they've got to spend 50 hours of mining over and over again. It's like real life. If every country consisted of just armies and governments and nothing else, there was no people, no towns, no regular jobs or actual normal human beings, just big governments passing rulings and going to fight other governments. It would work for a few hours, but the world would just fall apart, as it did in Life is Feudal MMO. There is no world without the bits in between. Because the game's grind at the beginning was so insufferable, everybody starting as a peasant, their only wish is to not be that anymore. Yet you need people as those peasants in order to make a game economy work. Life is Feudal MMO only implemented gameplay at the very start or the very end. There was nothing in between. No reason for you to get to the point where you have a nice little house as a farmer, have a few cows and a wife and just stop. And that's your life and that's how you live it. Because of how humans work, because of how people always want to be at the top, be the knight or the king in the game, nobody would settle at that level. This can sometimes work if you have a repeated influx of players. People will get out of being a peasant, become a knight, and then new players would come in to be and fill in those peasant roles. But because Life is Feudal MMO was dying at a speeding rate, there was no new players to fill those lower or even middle end bits of the game. No enjoyable gameplay loop to keep them in there, so it just imploded on itself. Life is Feudal MMO is actually a pretty good analogy of life. You start with very little, knowing very little, and everything takes ages to accomplish. You then can meet people who, some will be very toxic and a few that will take you under their wing. You can spend years improving and growing, learning skills slowly but surely and becoming something bigger and better. If you're lucky, you will gain success and make it worth everything that you spend all that time working for. And that's how it's supposed to work within the game. But it's a game, and nobody wants that. What I've just explained is how Life is Feudal perfectly imitates real life, which might sound like the perfect realistic game to you, but nobody wants a second real life. We already have one of them. We don't want another one that means more jobs, that means working through all the shit bits. Players don't want a second job. They don't want a second life to struggle through. The whole point of making an entertaining MMO is to make it fun for someone that has an hour to spare or 50 hours to spare. You need to give some value to the jump-in players and of course the hardcore realistic players. But there's no value for anybody that isn't willing to spend a whole second life within this title, which is why eventually people are going to leave. Because the people that actually do want to do that sort of thing are so few and far between. And that's what I think is Life is Feudal's biggest downfall. I thought it was an incredible title when it first came out. I loved Your Own and I still hop back into it every now and then. But since the developers have kind of stopped working on it, there's been hints that they're going to go back to it after they abandoned the MMO, but I don't know if it's really worth it anymore. It's a shame because I adore these kind of titles. And in my head, when I was younger, I saw this thing and thought, I want it to be as realistic as possible. I want to live the life of a medieval knight. But in reality, people don't want to do that. They may say or even think they do, but in practice, they want to have a fun game. They don't want to have another life.